All right, let's unpack the story of the Kyoto Protocol. It was basically the world's first major international agreement to try and tackle the massive challenge of climate change. But you might be wondering, why was a treaty like this even necessary in the first place? Well, to get that, we need to look at the fundamental problem it was actually designed to solve. It all comes down to something called greenhouse gases. You can think of them as this natural, invisible blanket for our planet. They trap the sun's heat and keep Earth warm enough for all of us to live here. I mean, without them, we'd basically be a frozen rock. The problem is, for the last century or so, human activity has been adding extra layers to that blanket, and that's causing the whole planet to overheat. And this isn't just a theory. You can actually measure the effect. By 2020, the planet's average surface temperature had already climbed a full 1.2 degrees Celsius above what it was before the industrial era. So this steady climb, all driven by our emissions, created this really clear and urgent need for some kind of coordinated global response. So, faced with this growing crisis, the international community got together to try and forge a plan, a truly groundbreaking, first-of-its-kind solution. And wow, it was quite a journey. The groundwork was really laid back in 1992 with the UN's climate change framework. Then the protocol itself was adopted in Kyoto, Japan in 1997. But what's fascinating is that it took another 8 years, all the way until 2005, for it to officially come into force. And here's what made it so revolutionary. The Kyoto Protocol wasn't just a bunch of recommendations or, some friendly suggestions. Nope. It was the first international treaty that actually established legally binding commitments for countries to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. So how exactly were these commitments structured? Well, the protocol operated on this key principle, this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. What that meant was that the binding targets were only set for the industrialized nations. The logic was pretty simple. These were the countries historically responsible for most of the greenhouse gases that were already up there in the atmosphere. So what was the actual target? The collective goal for all these developed nations was to cut their greenhouse gas emissions by an average of 5% below their 1990 levels. And this was all supposed to happen during the first commitment period, which ran from 2008 to 2012. Okay, but setting a target is one thing, right? Actually meeting it is a whole different ballgame. The protocol didn't just set goals. It introduced some really innovative, market-based ideas to help countries get there. At the heart of this whole thing was the idea of carbon trading, built on a model we call cap and trade. Here's how it works. A cap, or a limit, is set on the total amount of emissions allowed. Then, permits are given out to polluters. Now, if a company pollutes less than its allowance, it can sell its extra permits to another company that's having trouble meeting its target. It basically created a financial reason to pollute less. So there were 3 main tools that made this whole system work. And they were really revolutionary because they turned cutting emissions into a commodity you could actually buy and sell. You had direct emissions trading between countries. Then there was the clean development mechanism, which let a developed country earn carbon credits by, say, funding a solar farm in a developing nation. Joint implementation was pretty similar, but that happened between 2 developed countries. All this together created a global market to find the cheapest, most efficient ways to cut pollution. So, what was the long-term impact of the Kyoto Protocol? Where did the world go from there? Well, that first commitment period ended in 2012, and it got extended with something called the Doha Amendment for a second period that ran all the way to 2020. But even while that was going on, the global conversation was changing. By 2015, the world had agreed on a totally new framework that would eventually take over from Kyoto, the Paris Agreement. So what's Kyoto's real legacy? I mean, it faced huge challenges. The big one being that the world's largest emitter at the time, the United States, never actually ratified it. But its importance is just undeniable. It set this crucial precedent for legally binding climate action, and the whole architecture it created for international carbon markets is a direct ancestor of the systems we still use today. And that really leaves us with a final thought. The Kyoto Protocol wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was a vital, pioneering first step. It proved that international cooperation on climate was actually possible. And the lessons we learned from its successes and its failures, from its market ideas to its division of responsibility, are still shaping the global fight against climate change right now.